Welcome back. For this video, I want to talk about using quotes in an essay, how we can incorporate outside quotes. So obviously our first essay, our narrative essay, we didn't really have to worry about this, right? We were telling a personal story and we had dialogue, but we weren't really using, a quote from another source that we were going to put into our essay. So that's maybe one of the big differences with this argument essay, is that I'm asking you to use, I think, at least one outside source and include a quote from it. So my idea with this is that the readings that I'm giving you, like the couple that we talked about last week about student loans, make sure that you watch that video I posted talking about student loans and that discussion. Just want to make sure you guys didn't miss that. Excuse me. But I'm going to post an article like that for each of the suggested topics on that argument essay assignment sheet. With the idea being that whichever one of those topics you're doing, I'm going to provide, basically some research so that you guys don't have to go out and do it on your own, make it a little bit easier for you, and so that we can just kind of practice the skills of like finding a quote in a reading and working that into our own writing, which is also, something that we're going to need for the mastery test that we're doing here, like in the other video that I just made. Okay, so using quotes. The quotes are always going to be evidence for your argument in this kind of essay. So you're not giving a quote just to summarize what the article said, You want to make sure, like, if you're going to use a quote, it should be as a piece of evidence that's going to back up your argument. Your argument and your thesis is always number one. That's always the most important thing about the essay, is the thing that you're trying to convince the reader of. Everything else comes in service of that. So if you're using a quote, it should be to back up your argument, to further your argument, to provide proof, or to help you explain, like, why your argument is the correct one. There's two main things that you need to do when you're using a quote. First of all, you want to introduce the quote. Really, what with introducing the quote is you just don't want it to feel like it's been dropped in out of nowhere. You want the reader to know that it's coming, to maybe know where the quote comes from. So, the most basic way of doing this, so that doesn't just feel like it's dropped in out of nowhere, is to have something a beginning of the sentence where you say like, the article states, comma, and then you give us the quote, right? But you want to make sure that you give us whatever context we're going to need to understand the quote. So you might want to say, you could like say who the author is. You could say this author in their article, blah blah blah, says, and then you go into it up to giving us the quote. Another thing that you can do is try to like incorporate the quote into your own sentence. So you could be writing your own sentence, and you might say like the fact that, and then go into a quote, and then maybe we have a quote that's like 45 million Americans have student loans, end quote, shows that student loans are a big problem and need a solution, right? So you can do it without using one of those phrases like the author explains, or the author writes, or the text states, or something like that. The other way to do it would be to sort of incorporate it into your own sentence and just having the quotation marks, so that we can see like where it came from. So that's introducing the quote. I wouldn't, because of the idea of introducing a quote, I wouldn't probably start a paragraph with a quote. It's not a hard and fast rule. Like there's ways that you can do it successfully where it can work, but it's hard to do, and it can be complicated. So I would probably avoid that for now, starting a paragraph with a quote. I would try to make sure you have like at least one sentence before the quote, kind of setting it up, giving us the context so that we can understand it. The other thing that you want to do, and this might even be more important, is to explain the quote. So after you've introduced it, you give us the quote, and you end the quotation marks. What you want to do then is explain to us how that quote relates to your argument. If all of these quotes, like I was saying, are all supposed to be evidence for the thing you're trying to convince us of, you want to make sure that you explain to your audience how the quote that you just gave backs up your argument. Make that connection for us. I feel like when we're writing, it's easy to like be in our own heads, and we feel like it's obvious how the quote relates. Or like this is something where I'll see students like they'll make their argument or whatever, and they'll just kind of like tack a quote on the end of what they're saying, and be like thinking that the audience is going to see how that quote backs up what they've said. But I would always rather have you over explain, even if you feel like you're maybe repeating yourself, or whatever. I would always rather have you over explain the quote and tell us, okay, here's how this fits in with my argument. Here's how this is a piece of evidence backing up what I'm saying. I would rather have you take the time to do that, even if you feel like you're oversimplifying it, or like the audience should be able to figure it out. we don't want to leave it up to their interpretation. You want to make sure that the audience is interpreting the quote the same way the way that you want them to, you know? Because if you just put the quote out there, they might misunderstand it, or they might be focusing on the wrong part of the quote, or they might take away something from it that you don't want them to. So don't leave it up in the air like that. After you give the quote, have at least one sentence, maybe more, but have at least one sentence saying, and here's how this really, not in these words, but saying, explaining how it relates to your argument, you know? Like the example I gave of a quote about, how many people have student debt or something. After that, you could just say, like, this is affecting so many people and making their lives worse, and we need to find a solution for this, right? So you just want to make sure that whatever the quote is, or if it's a statistic or whatever else it is, that you then connect it back to your arguments, that the audience can kind of see how it's going to work as evidence to prove what you're saying. Um, so I don't know if I have much more to say about it, but you've got to make sure that you introduce the quote and you explain the quote. I wouldn't have a quote as the first sentence of a paragraph. I also wouldn't have it as the last sentence, because if it's the last sentence, then you have no room to explain it. So I would always probably have that. Another thing with using quotes, if you're ever having trouble with making a paper long enough, maybe even the papers for this class, using a quote can be a great way to make your paper longer. We don't want to just be throwing in quotes all over the place just to get to the number of pages that we need. Ideally, they would be, useful quotes that do help our argument. But if you have to introduce it, you give the quote, you explain it, that's like 3 sentences at least, maybe more, maybe 4 sentences. So it definitely is a good way to kind of, make your essay longer if that's something that you're struggling with. But yeah, we want to introduce it so it doesn't just feel like it's coming out of the blue, and then we want to explain it so that we connect the quote back to our thesis. And that's something in general where I feel like at the end of a body paragraph, it's always good to kind of explain to the audience like how everything that you've said so far goes back to the thesis. Because once you start giving examples, you start explaining things, it can be easy to forget like what the main point is, or if you ever feel like you're getting off topic. A good way to do that, to handle that, is at the end of the paragraph to kind of circle back and be like, this, shows that my argument is correct, and here's how it does that. So yeah, introduce quotes, explain quotes. We want to make sure that we're doing those sorts of things. All right, that's it for this video.